That's why when Jacob wrote his famous letter, what we now call the book of James, he transliterated his name into Greek. And if you ever read that letter in its original language, you'll see exactly what I'm talking about. The letter is written by... What if I were to tell you that Jesus did not have a brother named James? Would you believe me? Even though you've been told time and time again that the man who wrote the Epistle of James was the half-brother of Jesus, the man was not actually named James. And even though Jesus had two half-brothers who both wrote epistles that are included in the New Testament, neither of them ever went by the name James. Are you wondering what in the world I'm talking about? Good. Stick around for the remainder of this video and I'll explain everything. I'll also tell you how the man you know as James rose to become one of the leaders of the early church in Jerusalem. And I'll also tell you how he died as one of the first martyrs of the Christian faith. Now, as I've stated, the man who wrote the Epistle of James, and the oldest brother of Jesus Christ, was not named James. His name was actually Jacob. You see, Jesus and all of his siblings were good Jewish children with good Jewish upbringings. They spoke a dialect of Hebrew called Aramaic, and they lived in the territory known as Judea, or modern-day Israel. They never ever would have had anything other than Hebrew names. The name Jacob would have been pronounced Yaakov, and the name actually means supplanter, much like the first Jacob that we meet in the Bible, who was the son of Isaac and the younger brother of Esau. Now, both Jacob and Jesus also spoke Greek, since it was the lingua franca of the known world and of the Roman Empire during the time in which they lived. That's why when Jacob wrote his famous letter, what we now call the book of James, he transliterated his name into Greek. And if you ever read that letter in its original language, you'll see exactly what I'm talking about. The letter is written by 𝗏𝗏𝗏. Sounds a lot more like Jacob than it does like James, doesn't it? So the question is, when did Jacob's name get switched to James? And when did the name James get unofficially secured as the transliteration of the Greek name 𝗏𝗏𝗏? The answer? During the translation of the King James Bible. You see, when King James commissioned the translation of the Bible into the then modern day vernacular, what would become the official Bible of the Church of England, the translators thought it would be a good idea to pay tribute to the man who was paying for this incredible undertaking. To do that, they decided to translate the Greek word 𝗏𝗏𝗏, a cognate of the Hebrew name Yaakov, into the English name James. It's as simple as that. Isn't that a crazy story? And since then, every major English Bible translation has stuck with the tradition of translating the name 𝗏𝗏𝗏 as James in order to avoid any confusion. And just so you know, for those of you who are Bible heads, every other place in the Bible where you read about someone named James, and there's two of Jesus' disciples with that name, you're actually reading the Greek name 𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏, which in almost all the cases is very likely the cognate of the Hebrew name Yaakov. Now, for the second part of this video, I'm going to answer these questions. Who was Jacob, the oldest brother of Jesus, and how did he rise to become the leader of the church at Jerusalem, even though Jesus had 12 disciples who he trained during his earthly ministry? Now, as was stated before, Jacob was raised in a devout Jewish family, and he likely did everything he could to keep Jewish law and Jewish custom throughout his upbringing. According to most scholars, he was the oldest brother of Jesus and the second son born to Mary. So we know that Jesus was the firstborn, and Jacob, or James, was very likely the secondborn. He obviously had a different father than Jesus did. Now, while John chapter 7 and Mark chapter 8 both inform us that Jesus' siblings did not believe in him during his earthly ministry, there is a fair amount of uncertainty about what these statements mean. Did Jesus' siblings not understand what it meant that he was the Messiah? Did they not believe that he was the Son of God? Did they, like many of his followers, have a good amount of confusion regarding what the Messiah, what Jesus came to accomplish? Or were they just embarrassed about the fact that their brother had become the most famous person in Judea at that time, to the ire of the religious leaders who were more or less controlling the people of the area? The only thing we know for certain is that after his resurrection, all of Jesus' siblings became devout followers of his and strong believers in his messiahship. They were devout early Christians. And the Apostle Paul actually tells us that James, the brother of Jesus, or Jacob, was one of the few individuals that Jesus appeared to personally after his resurrection and before his ascension. Jesus appeared to many groups, but he only appeared to a few individuals, and his brother was one of them. So how did Jacob become one of the main leaders of the early church at Jerusalem? Many say the central leader of the early church at Jerusalem. Contrary to what many people assume, it was not because the disciples favored him because he was the brother of Jesus. It wasn't for silly, fleshly reasons. It was because he was deserving of it. According to the church fathers and to a church historian named Eusebius, Jacob was an extremely devout man. That's why he became known as Jacob the Just from the very earliest days of the church. Let me read to you what the earliest church historian, Eusebius, says about Jacob, the brother of Jesus. He was called the Just by everyone from the Lord's time to ours, since there were many Jacobs, but this one was consecrated from his mother's womb. He drank no wine or liquor and ate no meat. No razor came near his head, and he did not anoint himself with oil and took no baths. He used to enter the temple alone and was often found kneeling and imploring forgiveness for the people, so that his knees became like a camel's from his continual kneeling in worship of God and in prayer of the people. Now, it's important to remember that in the early centuries, for people both inside and outside the church, doing things like not wearing perfume and not taking baths, not eating meat and not drinking wine, were considered holy or devout things, because it showed that a person was more focused on spiritual things than they were on carnal things. But we also read about James, or Jacob, that he was consecrated from his mother's womb, meaning he was raised by his parents to be a very devout sort of individual, a very set apart type of person, and that he also spent more time than anybody in God's presence praying for the forgiveness of the people. Have you ever heard the expression, "they have knees like a camel"? It's often used by Christians to describe other Christians who spend a lot of time in prayer, a lot of time on their knees praying. As far as we know, that expression was first used about the brother of Jesus, Jacob the Just. So how did Jacob die? Well, according to historians like Josephus and Eusebius, and according to church fathers like Clement and Hegesippus, he was martyred for his faith in Jesus. He was likely accused of blasphemy by the Jewish leaders of his day because of his allegiance to Christ. He was very likely stoned to death, but Clement and Hegesippus both record that he was first thrown off of a high building of the temple, and after he survived the fall, he was finished off by stoning. He very likely died in the year 62 AD, which means that he was probably in his late 50s or early 60s when he became one of the first Christian martyrs. Well, I hope you found this video informative and helpful. I hope you enjoyed watching it as much as I enjoyed making it. If you did, please give us a thumbs up and consider subscribing to our channel so that we can keep making content just like this that helps illuminate biblical truth so that you can know and walk with Jesus like never before. If you want to know about any of the resources I used to make this video, I'll put links in the description below so you can check them out for yourself.